On the night of January 17, 1991, thousands of feet above western Iraq, an E-6B Prowler rode the dark edge of a strike package's route, its four-man crew staring at green cathode ray tubes as the first waves of Iraqi early warning radars snapped from thin search lines into solid blocks of saturated noise. In command bunkers below, radar operators who had spent years training on Soviet design systems tried to tune their scopes, adjusted gain and filters, and shouted at technicians to check the power supplies, but nothing restored the picture. The screens that once painted every aircraft in the sector now showed only a blinding electronic blizzard. What their commanders had long dismissed as harmless American noise had become something else entirely. A calibrated surgical assault on the nervous system of their integrated air defense network, orchestrated from a single aircraft whose crew had quietly studied every frequency the enemy owned. As the Prowlers and ALK 99 jamming pods lit up the spectrum and high-speed anti-radiation missiles rode reflections back toward the strongest emitters, Iraqi missile batteries launched into an empty sky, firing at phantoms while the bombers and stealth aircraft they were supposed to stop slipped unseen through the gaps. 2 decades earlier, when the E-6B first arrived in Southeast Asia, enemy commanders in North Vietnam had already grown accustomed to American jamming aircraft and believed they understood their limits. The U.S. Air Force's EB-66 destroyers and the Navy's earlier E-6A intruders had proven that noise could degrade guidance radars, but they also showed predictable patterns: bursts of barrage jamming tied to specific strike routes, narrow bands of coverage, and an obvious trade-off between protecting one package and leaving another exposed. North Vietnamese officers learned to treat that interference as a complication rather than a catastrophe, convinced that by adding more sites, dispersing their radars, and training operators to work through clutter, they could still guide SAW-2 missiles and MiG interceptors toward enough targets to exact a price. In their view, jamming was an irritation in the margins of a radar scope, something a clever operator could filter, not a weapon that could blind an entire theater. Grumman's engineers and the U.S. Navy's electronic warfare planners looked at the same problem and drew a very different conclusion. What if the jammer was not an escort tacked onto the edge of a formation, but a dedicated strike shield designed from the ground up to live in the harshest part of the electromagnetic battlefield? The result was the E-6B Prowler, a long-range, all-weather carrier-capable electronic warfare aircraft that took the proven A-6 intruder airframe and stretched it into a specialized 4-seat platform built around a tactical jamming system rather than bombs. The Prowler's forward fuselage was lengthened to accommodate one pilot and 3 electronic countermeasures officers, ECMO 1 in the right front seat, ECMO 2 and ECMO 3 in the rear, each surrounded by racks of receivers, analyzers, and control panels wired into the ALK 99 jamming pods slung under the wings and fuselage. Wherein a 6 crew saw radar only long enough to drop ordnance and egress, an E-6B crew lived inside that environment for hours, intercepting, classifying, and then attacking enemy emitters across a broad slice of the spectrum, with a system designed from day one to neutralize radars, communications, and data links. The Prowler entered fleet service in 1971, with the first aircraft delivered to NAS Whidbey Island, Washington, and deployed into combat over Vietnam in 1972, just as air defenses over the north were reaching their peak density. This standard E-6B was quickly followed by the EXCAP Expanded Capability version in 1973, which broadened the frequency coverage and gave crews finer control over how they attacked individual radars. Later ICAP-I and ICAP-II upgrades would further improve receivers, processors, and displays, gradually turning the cockpit from a reactive noise generator into an intelligence-driven command post that could spot, evaluate, and then tailor jamming to each threat radar on the fly. Even before the first HARM missile was wired to its pylons, the E-6B was already breaking the assumption that jamming had to be a blunt, non-discriminating tool. To understand why enemy officers so badly underestimated the Prowler, it is necessary to understand what the aircraft actually did when it made noise. Radar is a process of sending out pulses of electromagnetic energy, then measuring the faint echoes that return. Electronic warfare is the deliberate manipulation of that process, either by drowning those echoes in stronger signals, deceiving the radar into seeing false targets, or forcing it into modes that render it tactically useless. The ALK 99 tactical jamming system consisted of multiple pods, each housing receivers to sniff enemy signals and transmitters driven by high-power generators that could pour focused, agile interference back down those beams. The Prowler's receivers listened continuously across a wide band, feeding signal parameters to onboard processors and to the ECMO's scopes, where operators could identify specific radars by pulse repetition frequency, scan pattern, and operating band, then assign jamming tasks tailored to each one. Instead of a single wash of static, an E6B could layer spot jamming on a critical fire control radar, barrage jamming across early warning frequencies, and deceptive techniques that created phantom formations where no aircraft existed at all. Over Vietnam, this capability began to change the nature of how U.S. strike packages approached some of the most heavily defended targets on Earth. North Vietnam's integrated air defense system, built around Soviet SA-2 Surfacito air missiles, radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery, and ground-controlled intercept fighters, relied on early warning radars to cue engagement radars and command and control networks to concentrate fire at the right altitudes and bearings. A traditional jammer might blunt that edge along a narrow corridor. The Prowler's job was to make the entire picture unreliable, forcing North Vietnamese operators to choose between emitting and being targeted or shutting down and going blind. As EXCAP and later ICAP variants arrived, E6BS evolved from mere escorts into mission linchpins. If they were not overhead, some strikes simply did not launch. The Prowler's physical performance was modest by fighter standards, a maximum speed of around 610 miles per hour at sea level, a service ceiling near 38,000 feet, and a range on the order of 2,400 miles. But its value lay in how those numbers translated into persistence. Built on the sturdy intruder airframe, it could loiter with the strike package from the carrier deck to target and back, withstand the buffet of low-altitude ingress when required, and return to the ship with enough endurance to support follow-on waves. The crew of 4 divided tasks among flying, threat detection, emitter analysis, and jamming control, turning what would have been an unmanageable workload for a 2-man crew into a continuous, orchestrated operation that adapted minute by minute as the threat picture changed. Each ECMO had access to a different set of displays and controls, allowing one to manage communications jamming, another to focus on high-priority fire control radars, and a third to monitor the overall electromagnetic environment and coordinate with other assets such as harm-shooting strike fighters and ground-based intelligence nodes. When the guns fell silent in Southeast Asia, the E-6B did not fade into irrelevance. Instead, it became more central to American power projection as air defenses around the world grew more dense and more sophisticated. Through the late 1970s and 1980s, Prowlers deployed in support of operations in Lebanon, Grenada, Libya, and the Persian Gulf, flying from carriers as the electronic shield for battle groups and expeditionary strike forces. During the 1986 raids on Libya and later in Operation Praying Mantis against Iranian forces in 1988, E-6BS jammed hostile radars and communications, ensuring that enemy fire control networks never achieved coherent locks on U.S. aircraft and ships. Each operation reinforced a pattern that foreign intelligence analysts began to notice. Wherever the United States intended to fly or sail into contested airspace, Prowlers appeared near the center of the order of battle. At the same time, the aircraft itself was being quietly rearmed. Originally conceived as an unarmed electronic attack platform, the E-6B gained provisions to carry the AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile, a weapon designed to home on radar emissions and destroy the source before it could shut down or shift frequency. Mounted on underwing pylons, HARMS gave Prowler crews the ability not only to blind radars temporarily with jamming, but to permanently remove them from the fight, turning the choice for enemy operators into an even harsher dilemma. Continue emitting under jamming and risk an incoming missile, or shut down to survive and concede local airspace to American strike aircraft. Nowhere was that dilemma clearer than in Operation Desert Storm. By 1991, the United States Air Force had retired its F-111 Raven, making the Navy and Marine Corps E-6B Prowlers the only dedicated radar jamming aircraft available to protect not just naval aviation, but the entire coalition air armada. A Congressional Research Service assessment noted that the Prowler had effectively become the sole airborne radar jamming system across the U.S. services, responsible for countering enemy air defenses in every major theater. National Naval Aviation Museum summaries of the war's air operations captured their importance bluntly. Availability of E-6BS was a go/no-go criterion for many strike missions. If Prowlers were not available to provide defense suppression, the missions did not fly. During the first nights over Iraq and Kuwait, E-6BS from carrier squadrons and Marine units orbited at carefully chosen altitudes and positions. Their ALK-99 pods radiating patterns of energy tuned to Iraqi early warning radars, acquisition radars for SAW-2, SAW-3, and SAW-6 missile batteries, and even communications links tying together command posts and interceptor bases. Coalition strike planners had mapped the Iraqi integrated air defense system in detail. Prowler crews carried loadouts of pre-planned jamming programs that could be modified on the fly as new emitters appeared or old ones shut down. In some sectors, E-6BS delivered focus spot jamming against individual high-threat radars to allow F-117s and Tornadoes to slip through narrow windows. In others, they poured barrage jamming across wide bands, turning entire sectors of the Iraqi air picture into an unintelligible blur. The power of those emissions was such that they did not merely inconvenience enemy systems, they shocked friendly ones. Naval aviation accounts from Desert Storm describe how, once Prowler crews were finally allowed to use the ALK-99 at combat power rather than peacetime training settings, their jamming made even US F-14 Tomcat radar homing and warning gear go crazy, triggering multiple false alarms and saturating displays. For Iraqi radar operators who had never experienced that level of electronic attack in training, the effect was far worse. Radars that had performed predictably for years behaved erratically or went completely blind, while communication circuits filled with indecipherable hash. What their doctrine had treated as background noise became a weapon that collapsed the timing and coordination on which their air defense tactics depended. In parallel, the E-6B's new role as a harm shooter meant that its crew no longer had to rely on escort fighters to execute suppression of enemy air defenses. The same receivers and signal processors used to drive the ALK-99 could cue AGM-88 missiles, allowing the Prowler to detect, classify, jam, and then physically attack a radar within a single mission. When Iraqi sites attempted to burn through jamming by increasing power or switching modes, they only made themselves brighter targets for harms whose seekers were tuned to the very emissions they were trying to push through the noise. Those that chose to shut down often did so only after watching their scopes flicker and die under the weight of energy pouring out of the ALK-99, knowing that their absence from the network left entire sectors uncovered. This combination of broad area jamming and surgical destruction of radar nodes did more than protect individual aircraft. It eroded the confidence of enemy commanders in the very idea of an integrated air defense system. For decades, Soviet doctrine and the doctrines of clients who bought Soviet hardware had promised that overlapping radars, dense missile belts, and centralized command would render large-scale air attacks impossible or prohibitively costly. Yet in Iraq, that architecture collapsed in a matter of days under the strain of stealth aircraft like the F-117 attacking leadership nodes, while E-6BS blinded and dismantled the radars those leaders relied on to see the threat coming. In after-action analyses, coalition air planners repeatedly highlighted electronic attack, especially the contributions of the E-6B, as a decisive factor in keeping aircraft losses far below pre-war estimates. If you appreciate discovering Cold War and post-Cold War secrets that were once buried inside classified after-action reports and technical annexes, consider subscribing to Classified Warfare for future declassified revelations drawn from the systems and crews that shaped these hidden battles. Desert Storm was not the Prowler's last war, it was a mid-career showcase. Through the 1990s, E-6BS were present in virtually every major U.S. combat operation, from enforcing no-fly zones over Iraq to supporting air campaigns in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. During Operation Allied Force in 1999, Prowlers once again found themselves at the center of a confrontation between Western air power and a dense, Soviet-designed integrated air defense system, this time Serbian, with decades of practice at tracking NATO aircraft. An account by an E-6B pilot describing the Balkans campaign notes that the Prowler was the aircraft that flew the most missions of the war, accompanying every strike package across the 78-day air operation. Serbian commanders, like their Iraqi counterparts, initially believed that their mix of long-range early warning radars, mobile SAW-6 and SAW-3 batteries, and low-altitude guns would at least inflict attrition on any sustained campaign. Yet night after night, E-6B crews orbited on the edges of Serbian airspace, pouring jamming into acquisition and fire control radars while Allied aircraft maneuvered under their umbrella. Reports from NATO pilots recall a palpable sense of calm knowing that somewhere in the darkness, prowlers were on station, blinding the very systems that had downed NATO aircraft in earlier conflicts. When Serbian SAM operators did manage to score rare successes, they tended to do so by exploiting gaps, shutting down radars and firing optically or in brief, opportunistic bursts, tactics that acknowledged that staying on the air under E-6B coverage had become a near suicidal proposition. The role of the Prowler became even more interesting when paired with stealth aircraft like the B-2 Spirit. The B-2, with its flying wing design and ultra-low radar cross-section, could penetrate deep into defended airspace with minimal signature, but even stealth aircraft were not invulnerable. In certain environments and frequency bands, especially against long-wavelength radars, additional protection was still valuable. Airpower analyses point out that even B-2s benefited from E-6B support in some scenarios, particularly when flying into areas saturated with legacy radars that might glimpse a fleeting return from a stealth bomber under the right conditions. In those cases, the Prowler's jamming effectively erased those marginal returns, turning possible detection into meaningless noise, and ensuring that any fragments of information Serbian or Iraqi operators collected never cohered into a usable track. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, modernization programs such as ICAP-III further sharpened the Prowler's capabilities. Upgraded receivers, digital signal processors, and improved crew interfaces allowed E6BS to handle more emitters simultaneously, react faster to frequency-agile radars, and integrate more seamlessly into joint command networks that fuse data from AWACS, National Technical Means, and ground-based sensors. The aircraft that had first flown combat over Vietnam now sat at the nexus of a far more complex battle space, serving not just as a jammer but as an airborne electronic warfare node passing threat libraries and situational updates to other shooters. Meanwhile, the basic premise held: so long as the E-6B was overhead, the enemy's radar picture could not be trusted. In Afghanistan and later in Iraq after 2003, E-6BS continued to support operations, even in environments where the enemy lacked the dense radar networks of a Yugoslavia or Iraq. Here, their ability to jam communications, data links, and improvised trigger systems became more prominent, illustrating that the spectrum was no longer just about radars and missiles, but about every electronic channel an adversary might use to coordinate. Prowler crews adapted from hunting fixed SAW-2 and SAW-6 sites to suppressing pop-up threats and providing electronic overwatch for ground forces, a shift that underscored how far electronic warfare had expanded beyond the traditional SEAD mission. Yet even in these irregular conflicts, the psychological effect on opponents remained similar. When their communications nets failed without warning or their attempts to coordinate were met with silence and confusion, they knew something unseen was reaching into their systems. From the perspective of adversary engineers and commanders, the hardest lesson to swallow was that the E-6B's effectiveness did not depend on any single trick or secret frequency. It derived from a disciplined, data-driven approach to electronic warfare. U.S. and allied intelligence agencies devoted enormous effort to cataloging foreign radars, recording their waveforms, and modeling their behavior. Every time a Prowler flew near a potential adversary's airspace, its receivers soaked up emissions that were later analyzed and added to threat libraries. When conflict finally broke out, those libraries allowed E-6B crews to recognize and counter radars almost instantly, generating precisely calibrated jamming instead of crude, broadband blasts. The result was that attempts to work around jamming, by changing frequencies, altering pulse patterns, or deploying new sets, often fell flat because the Prowler's system had already anticipated those moves. This is what made foreign claims that they could simply filter out American jamming so tragically misplaced. Filtering presupposes that the signal and the noise are distinct phenomena, that with clever enough algorithms or skilled enough operators, one can separate the useful echo from the interference. But the E-6B's philosophy was to merge the two, to shape jamming so that it occupied the same bands, the same timing windows, and often the same apparent directions as genuine reflections, forcing radars to either accept corrupted information or reject everything. In many cases, Prowler crews exploited radar side lobes and antenna patterns so thoroughly that even off-axis energy designed to be invisible to operators became pathways for interference, turning theoretical design strengths into operational vulnerabilities. Of course, no system is perfect, and the Prowler's own history includes moments of tragedy and controversy, such as the 1998 Cavali's cable car accident in Italy when a USMC E-6B on a low-level training flight struck a ski gondola cable, killing 20 civilians. That incident, while unrelated to electronic warfare performance, ensured that the aircraft's silhouette became infamous far beyond military circles and sparked intense scrutiny of its operations in Europe. Yet even as public attention focused on that disaster, inside NATO air forces the Prowler remained defined less by that accident than by its quiet, nightly presence above the Balkans, where crews continued to blind and confuse Serbian defenses for the remainder of the Kosovo conflict. By the time the U.S. Navy retired its last E-6BS in 2015 and the Marine Corps followed in 2019, the aircraft had served more than 4 decades, from the late Vietnam era through the final years of the global war on terror. It had flown from every class of American aircraft carrier, Enterprise, Nimitz, Kitty Hawk, and John F. Kennedy, ranging from the Mediterranean to the Arabian Gulf, from the Adriatic to the Arabian Sea. Museums that accepted retired Prowlers often received airframes with more than 6,000 flight hours and hundreds of arrested landings on their logs, physical evidence of a life spent almost continually forward deployed. Defense studies produced late in its service life acknowledged that for many years the E-6B had been not just a Navy or Marine Corps asset but a joint one, the only aircraft capable of providing radar jamming coverage for Air Force and Allied strike packages as well. In the end, what the E-6B Prowler truly shattered was not a single radar site over Baghdad, Belgrade, or Hanoi, but the belief that jamming was secondary to real weapons. Time after time, post-conflict analyses of air campaigns concluded that bombs and missiles owed much of their success to the electronic conditions the Prowler created before they ever left the pylon. Surface-to-air missile crews who once trained to brace themselves against supersonic aircraft and exploding warheads instead found their scopes useless, their communications garbled, and their carefully drilled engagement sequences broken at every step. Commanders who had boasted that no aircraft could cross their borders unchallenged discovered that the real fight had taken place not at the edge of the atmosphere or above the speed of sound, but inside waveguides, antennas, and algorithms they had assumed would always work. The Prowler's successor, the E-18G Growler, now carries forward many of the same mission sets with newer airframes and more advanced systems, but the conceptual template remains the one the E-6B proved in combat. Build a platform whose entire reason for existence is to dominate the electromagnetic spectrum. Crew it with specialists who understand the enemy's radars and networks as well as their own. Integrate it so tightly into strike planning that its absence becomes unthinkable. From Vietnam to the Gulf, from the Balkans to Afghanistan, the Prowler showed that air defenses do not have to be destroyed physically to be defeated. It is enough to make them blind, confused, or afraid to turn on. By the time enemy air defense officers finally admitted, usually in the quiet language of classified reports, that their radar screens had become battlefields in their own right, the E-6B was already on the verge of retirement, its legacy embedded in doctrines, threat libraries, and the design of every modern integrated air defense system that now assumes it will face jamming as aggressive and intelligent as any missile. That admission is the Prowler's final verdict. Jamming was never just noise. In the hands of a 4-man crew riding a twin-engine Grumman airframe into hostile airspace, it was an invisible hammer that broke the enemy's ability to see long before the first bomb ever fell. Join us here at Classified Warfare as we continue to uncover the operations and technologies, from Prowlers and Growlers to stealth bombers and space-based sensors, that kept the world on the brink while ensuring that, when the radar screens went dark, it was America that still owned the sky.